back at this church here in Portland. I want to introduce my wife, Fran, who is the. How many of you have heard of Yes Magazine? Good. Okay. Fran, as you probably know, is the publisher, and she's going to go around with a sign-up sheet if you're not on the Yes newsletter, and also on my newsletter. So with that little detail out of the way. Yeah, it's been quite some time since I've been to this church. How many of you are members of this church or participants in this church? Okay. And how many of you are here for the UUGA, delegates and others? Okay. Is there anybody here who's not a UU? Okay. I go in that category too. I'm unaffiliated, but I have a deep affinity for UUs, including for my wife who is a UU, so we're all family. The UU theme for this General Assembly is building a new way. What's 5,000 to 6,000 people here engaged in conversations about turning the human course. The theme I'm going to speak about connects particularly to the UU 7th principle. Respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Now, I suspect we all resonate to that frame quite naturally. And as I will elaborate, I think that is part of our nature as human beings. That is who we are. We are part of the web of life. But we have forgotten. We need to recover the story. We need to reclaim it in a far deeper way than most of us have been prone to do within modern society. And so I'm hoping that this presentation will help us with that connection. Certainly that is the primary theme of Change the Story, Change the Future, a living economy for a living earth. It's always particularly exciting for me to come to Portland. I grew up in Longview, Washington, as some of you know, so this is pretty much home for me. We came down here from time to time to visit the big city. And here you are. And of course now Portlandia is building the model for the cities of the future and building a city not as the high-tech glass and steel wonder with drones whizzing around, but of a real community deeply embedded in nature and place. And that must be our journey. So I come out of a business school background, and one of the positive things I learned in business school, a very helpful thing, is look at the big picture. If you identify a problem, you may have, you've got to solve the problem, but most of the problems that draw our attention are symptoms of some kind of system failure. Now, we're learning to focus on that within a business, particularly a big corporation, and that's what I taught at the Harvard Business School. But as many of you know, I know so many of you we're familiar. We have related together. We've been together at previous presentations, and I know many of you read my books. So you probably mostly know that Fran and I spent the majority of our adult professional lives working in international development, working overseas. And it is the experience of the economic processes playing out all around the world, particularly in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the areas that we have committed ourselves to developing. Seeing that play out in terms of the devastation of people's lives, of the environment, of culture, and so forth, is very much what drew me to this inquiry. And always within this large frame of, okay, if things are going so badly wrong, what are the systemic causes? Because if we try to solve the problem without a systemic framework and analysis, we will treat symptoms, and we will never solve the problem. We may alleviate symptoms, we may help a few poor people, we may save a few trees or endangered species, but in the end we lose unless we address the system that is creating the problem. So I'm going to take you through a little journey, big picture journey. We'll touch on the current human crisis, but I assume you're all here because you're well aware that we're in deep trouble. So I'm not going to attempt to depress you further. If you're not already badly depressed, you're not paying attention. But then I'm going to, as Mel was talking about, I've come to realize the importance of our story frames, that they're foundational to how we think about problems, how we think about our relationships to each other and to creation. And I'm going to look at the story that has got us trapped currently, and I'm going to take a leap up to the cosmic level, to the level of the dynamics, the forces, the nature of creation itself, which is the deepest story essential to our understanding. And then I'm going to bring it down to a living earth and ultimately to a living economy. And the defining frame is a very simple truth that I suspect you'll all immediately recognize, but you hardly ever hear it spoken. We are living beings, born of and nurtured by a living earth, itself born of a living universe. And that changes everything. So, one of the things that's special about this moment, as Mel mentioned, is a sense of awakening to the imperative for deep change. Now, many of us have been aware of that for quite some time. It is not news. But there is always a process in deep change in society of a few people begin to get it, and they begin to spread the word, and you're just shouting and beating and so forth, and you don't seem to make any progress. But the word is spreading. The awareness is spreading. And then we have these breakthrough moments of possibility. And I sense we are very much coming to a breakthrough moment of possibility, creating a possibility for very deep change. And I just want to note three critical framing points of awareness that set the context for our time. First, the Occupy movement and the contribution it made to raising broad awareness of inequality, extreme inequality, as a problem of our time. Foundation. Then we've been going through this remarkable awakening as a consequence of police shootings of young black men and the frame of Black Lives Matter. Now, of course, at the deeper level, what we're seeing, we're seeing a general public awareness of what many of us have been seeing for a long time, is the extreme injustice of our justice system. And the fact that in the United States we have a higher proportion of people in prison than any other country in the world, and we consider this the land of freedom and democracy. And of course they're disproportionately black and people of color. And one of the things we're waking up to more generally as a society is that unless justice is secure for all of us, it is not secure for any of us. That creates a new sense of solidarity. Then we have this remarkable Pope Francis. Are we all thinking of converting to Catholicism? This is an extraordinary document, as you know, and it is calling us to rethink our nature at the very deepest level. And it is also calling out capitalism and an inherently unjust and destructive economic system. I particularly love the homily that Pope Francis put out a bit ago on the idolatry of money. A very simple frame. Money itself is not evil. It is the worship of money as a false god that is evil. And that so nails it in terms of the frame that I'm going to be discussing. We are literally a society of money worshipers. And it is very much our undoing. Then we have this very recent development, which David spoke about with the TPP. And this shocking, stunning development of President Obama joining an alliance with the corporate right, with the Republicans who sought to destroy him, and in an alliance to push through an agreement that in its every provision, as far as we know, is contrary to the interests of people and nature, and is basically about strengthening the rights, privileges, and power of global corporations that know no allegiance to any country, place, or person. Now, it's very depressing, but it's also a very awakening moment. And it sets the stage for a deep and powerful political realignment. I just published an article on this about the depth of what's involved, but also the possibility on the YES website. And so if you go to yesmagazine.org, it's getting a lot of attention and spreading very rapidly. And it's just highlighting the obvious. We now have a very clear picture of the political alignments in the United States. It's not about big government versus small government. It is about corporate rule versus democracy. And now, it's not going to be easy to pull that off, but it is absolutely essential, and the issues are now clear. So, those of you who have read The Great Turning from Empire to Earth Community, which I put out several years ago, know that I put this whole thing in a deep historical perspective, essentially 5,000 years of empire. Going back when in the Middle East we first began the formation, we humans first began the formation of empires, of organizing human societies by dominator structures that give a few people the power to control and maintain the majority of people in conditions of serfdom. That has played out for 5,000 years. When democracy first started to come in and introduced in the UK, the kings began to realize, well, if we sort of shift the power over to corporations, we can kind of get around the democratic parliaments and accountability and so forth, and maintain a separate power structure. And that's been playing out ever since. We've had these flirtations with democracy in the United States. Democracy remains our goal and our dream, but we still have a long ways to go as a species in making that a reality. And it is absolutely essential if we are going to create a just world, but also to create a world that lives in balance with nature. So that makes this moment an extraordinary defining moment in the whole of the human experience. And many people are waking up. We have many, many initiatives of all sorts. People working to live the new into being, rebuilding community, rebuilding their local economies, bringing in more environmentally balanced kinds of technologies and lifestyles. These are all very positive. But what we have yet to do on the progressive side is find our common framing story. And I'm going to say more about that and see how the corporate right dominates the story. Now here's why this story piece is so crucial. We humans are a species of almost infinite variety of possibilities. It is in a sense our nature to choose our nature. We do that through our stories. To live together in a community, we have to have some shared values and shared expectations, which reflect our understanding of a reality. And you'll see a little bit more what how deep I go with this question of what is reality. But it is a reality so complex, so far beyond our human understanding, that we cannot possibly, at least in our current state of development, understand its real nature. So we have to live by stories that are approximations of reality. And there are many different stories. And of course, one of the values of a UU, and it tends to be a progressive value, is that, well, you know, we need to honor everyone's story, which in a sense we do. But at another level, some stories, in fact, correspond more closely to reality than others. They are not, in fact, all equal. Now, part of what's distinctive about UUs is the search, the question, the asking the questions, not just taking received wisdom. And this is a challenge of our time, is to draw from all the sources of human understanding and knowledge, to evolve our story to a deeper and deeper understanding that is necessary to get ourselves out of our current dilemma. And one of the things I try to do is boil this down to the simplest possible elements. And of all, you know, all the things I'm going to tell you tonight, or that you're going to read in my books, they're all things that you know. Indeed, they are things that I believe we are born in, because the deepest knowledge, the idea of Earth as our living mother, comes out of indigenous wisdoms. It's the earliest human story, and it is the starting point. But we are continuously told and taught in our educational systems, in the corporate media, we're taught simplistic stories that capture only a part of the reality and that actually present a block to recognizing our true nature. We come down to two key variables. What is most important? What is most sacred? What is most essential to our well-being, to our existence? Money or life? Money or life? And how do we best organize to govern ourselves, to organize ourselves? Corporate rule or democracy? There's two basic variables. Money or life is our defining value, the criteria by which we measure progress, measure our success. And are we best ruled by global corporations that are accountable only to financial markets? Or do we best rule ourselves as democracies, organized around nations of people to whom our national governments are truly accountable and that work in the service of people and community? Those are the two challenges, because of course we are currently in a society that, as we discussed before, values life only for its market price and its financial value. And we're in a society increasingly ruled by corporations, with our national governments and our politicians answering not to the people who elect them, but to the corporations that finance them. Now, the system under which we live, I actually characterize it in the new edition of When Corporations Rule the World as a robotic system. By which I mean, it is a system that operates on autopilot. Ultimately, it's controlled by financial markets that are largely computerized. Now, we see the financiers and we see the corporate CEOs and we think they're in charge of the system. We far better understand what's going on if we recognize that they are but well-compensated servants of a system that they do not control. And they are powerless to change in a positive direction. That has deep implications, because it means the impetus for change has to come from those of us outside the system, or those who are within, who are prepared to help weaken it and sabotage it from within. Now, when you get a system that measures its purpose and its performance, its progress, by the accumulation of financial assets, and you have a system governed by an economics that says we make our decisions, best make our decisions by evaluating every choice on the basis of which will produce the highest return to money. And think about that. What is the implication if you manage your system that way? You will get an ever-growing concentration of money. We manage the system to manage financial returns to people who already have money. It is the most fundamental of logic, which anyone who is not suffering brain damage from taking too many economics courses can easily grasp. I often mention if you think you don't understand economics because it doesn't make any sense, I say you do understand economics because it doesn't make any sense, at least the way it's taught. Okay, we got that down. We can move on. Anyhow, once you begin to understand this system and understand that it is geared to concentrating wealth and power, and then you begin to realize that much of the money making now in Wall Street is creating money, using money to make money from nothing. We call that phantom wealth. But we have this incredible compounding of financial assets by all these tricky maneuvers and scams. You don't really have to understand the details. All you have to know is that it is a scam and that it's making money out of nothing for people who are producing absolutely nothing of value for the society. And that's going to stop. Now, what's happening is those assets reflect no real value, but in our society it gives those people who hold those assets the power to buy up all our essential means of living, starting with land and water. But essentially buying up, concentrating under the institution of the corporation, unlimited concentrations of monopoly control of everything we need to live. Okay, for us to get access then, we have to have money. But we can only get the money from the same corporations. Oh, so how do we get money from those corporations? We have two choices. One is wage slavery, the other is debt slavery. And of course, one way they accumulate those financial assets is through the destruction of workers, destruction of natural resources, destruction of life. So you begin to put that together and you see an inevitable pattern within the system playing out toward ever-increasing inequality, environmental destruction, wars and violence and so forth in the competition for the means of living. And it can only go in one direction so long as that system maintains in its current form. So that's why we need deep change. So why do we acquiesce? Well, here's a story. You've heard this story. It is taught in economics courses. It is constantly repeated in media. Elements of it are even taught, even preached in some churches. I've just been reading a book about how the corporate interests starting back in the Depression began buying off certain ministers and churches to preach the message that capitalism is God's way. Actually, before I tell you the story, I want to tell you a little story of my own. Back in March of 2012, this was just before the Rio Earth Summit, I had the privilege of participating in a retreat with an international group of indigenous environmental leaders. And they were getting ready to go to Rio Plus 12. And with their message, recognizing that the Wall Street interests were there saying, yes, we recognize we need to protect nature. To protect nature, we need to value nature. That means we have to put a price on her. So, these indigenous leaders are a little smarter than most of us. They recognize what's going on here. Okay, you privatize, commodify, securitize. You're creating so you take over and play financial games with our Earth Mother. Their response: Earth is our sacred mother, She is not for sale. That is starting a profound bit of wisdom about it doesn't make any difference how much money we can make from the destruction of nature. That is not wealth creation. That is destruction of the foundations of our existence. So one of the participants in this gathering was Karma Sateen, who is the head of the Bhutan Gross National Happiness Commission. I'm sure you've all heard of the Bhutan Gross National Happiness Indicators. He gave us a very nice presentation about what they're doing, the framing behind it, and so forth. And he ended with 3 words. Time is life. Time is life. I was stunned. Why was I stunned? My daddy taught me time is money. He was a businessman. If you've been to business school, you know for almost everything you're doing, your financial calculations, the basis of everything is the time value of money. Time is money. So you think about it. If we live by the story, time is money, how does that differ from if we live by the story, time is life? Did you have a good day today? Did you make a killing? Or did you make a living? And think about living in the broadest sense, not just surviving, but living. That establishes the foundational frame that we're dealing with here, of moving from a time is money world to a time is life world. Now, here's the story we're caught up in. I call it the sacred money and market story. These are the elements. Time is money. Money is wealth. Making money creates wealth. And making money, creating wealth, is a defining purpose of people, business, and the economy. Maximizing returns to money maximizes the wealth and prosperity of all. You ever heard this? The rich are society's wealth creators. Affluent lifestyles are their fair and just reward. Material consumption drives prosperity and is the path to happiness. Paying attention? Poverty is a consequence of laziness. The earth belongs to us. It is our human nature to be individualistic, competitive, and inquisitive. And guided by the invisible hand of the free market, these beneficial traits unleash the creative power of humanity to grow the economy, to create wealth, end poverty, and drive the technological innovation required to eliminate our human dependence on nature. The community interest, there is no community, there is no society. The community interest is simply an aggregation of the individual private interests of its individual members. We therefore all do best when we each focus on maximizing our own individual private financial return. In corporations, they're groups of people working together for the cause of freedom, democracy, and mutual prosperity. They're entitled to free treatment and the same rights as any person. So how many elements of that statement are accurate? Did anyone detect any statement there that was accurate? So we have the question, why do we accept this story? Of course, part of it is that we don't hear any other story in public. And so I may hear that story and it doesn't make any sense to me, but everybody else seems to accept it, so maybe I'm just stupid or maybe I'm crazy or something. So part of our challenge is challenging the story and coming up with an alternative. Now, another reason goes to this issue of our cosmologies, our deepest beliefs about the nature of reality. And I'm just going to run through this very quickly because we need to be going to the getting to the Q&A and a little interaction. I talk about in both of these books the three cosmologies, basic creation stories, familiar to most of us in the West. The first story is the distant patriarch. The second story is the grand machine, and the third story is the mystical unity. Now, by the distant patriarch story, all being, all knowing, all agency resides with the patriarch who lives apart in heaven. My most important relationship is to him. The meaning of my life is to figure out what he wants and conform to that to get on his good side, to get a good place in the afterlife. So, agency, relationship, and meaning. The distant patriarch, the grand machine, which is associated with science, is a story in the Newtonian form of the giant clock winding down as the spring unwinds. All as a consequence of mechanism, and then by more modern modifications, mechanism and chance. But it's all basically deterministic. There is no agency. Everything is related, but it's like the gears in a clock grinding out against each other. And there is no meaning. There's no purpose. Wow. I'm here alone in a meaningless universe with no purpose. Consciousness is just an illusion. Life itself is nothing more than an accidental outcome of material complexity. Wow, that's kind of depressing. I think I'll go shopping. Then there's a mystical unity story, that everything is one. That what we experience as material reality is an illusion born of the ego, and that is the cause of our suffering, because the ego is the cause of our separation, which is the source of violence and pain. So the answer is deep meditation, to transcend, to get rid of, let go of the ego, and meld into the oneness. Now it's interesting to me that none of those cosmologies, as described in its most familiar version, gives us any particular reason to care for Earth or to make things work here in a creative way. Now, what's emerging is a new cosmology that draws elements of truth from many, many sources, including these three cosmologies. It starts with a recognition from the stories of science that the actual unfolding of creation bears no resemblance whatever to a clock winding down. To the contrary, the arrow of creation is toward ever greater complexity, beauty, awareness, and possibility. Oh, that begins to get interesting. What I'm seeing emerging is a story that begins with some form of spirit, unitary consciousness, awareness, the deep mystery beyond our understanding. But I think of it, this is maybe anthropomorphizing, but we are, I believe, manifestations of that spirit. We ourselves are characterized by our drive to know, to become, to create, to evolve in community toward ever greater beauty, awareness, and possibility. So I'm thinking that at some deep level, this spirit in a drive to know itself and its possibilities, birthed forth in something that looked like the scientist's great energy cloud. But of course, that cloud was in a constant process of these energy particles joining together to form more complex particles, atoms, more complex atoms, and molecules, and ultimately into stars and star systems and galaxies. And along the way, one of the suns had a planet that began to evolve this carbon-based life. And it started out with the simplest of organisms, single-celled organisms. And these organisms somehow organized into a global community and working with the geological processes of Earth, through processes that we have the barest understanding, but we know it somehow happened. Fundamentally transform the conditions on the surface of this particular planet in ways we have so far not discovered on any other planet, creating the conditions for more complex and higher form, more aware forms of life to emerge. And part of what they did was they captured excess toxins and carbons out of the atmosphere and sequestered them deep under Earth. Okay, so these simple cells became more complex cells, and then they began to form into multi-cell organisms. And then these organisms continued to evolve, and we had different forms of plants and animal life and so forth, and ultimately the emergence of a species called human. Now it's interesting to think about our human body. I was made aware of this about 15 years ago when I met a little Asian microbiologist, Dr. Mei-Wan Ho, a chance meeting, and she told me about her study. She says a conventional biologist to study life will take a cell and grind it up and study its chemical composition and think they should learn something about life. She says, I study living cells as living cells. And I study the ways in which they manage nutrients, energy, information, water, in order to maintain their own living conditions. And then I study how these cells exchange energy, information, nutrition, water, to create and maintain larger organisms. All the while, each of these communities of life creating the conditions essential to a higher form of life. Well, that's kind of interesting. So then you think about our individual bodies, each of our bodies, everyone in this room. Our bodies are comprised of tens of trillions of individual cells, and that doesn't even include all the tens of trillions of biomes that we're beginning to learn about that are also part of our natural processes. All of these cells self-organizing by, again, processes that we have only the barest understanding of, to create a being far beyond the capacities of any of the individuals. Now you begin to think of that as a true miracle of life's capacity to self-organize to a purpose, on a trajectory. And you begin to really understand the extraordinary miracle of our existence, and a sense of the extraordinary trajectory of creation, and a recognition that every being in creation is a contributor to that process. You know, some are rogues. We have cancer cells, we have invasive species, and we have some that don't do too well. Usually they end up destroying themselves by destroying their host. And of course, we're acting like cancer cells and invasive species. But we have the potential, if we get our stories right, to become a positive species, to contribute to the unfolding of the whole. Now, one of the tragedies of our time is that we have no institutional spaces currently for examining at the deepest level our stories. Mostly our churches teach dogma as taught in some ancient, long-dead text. Science is locked into this mechanistic story just beginning barely to admit that maybe there may be something called consciousness. Maybe there is some intention somewhere in creation. But just waking up to that possibility. So even our academic institutions, which are all divided up into silos, fragmenting knowledge in ways that make it virtually impossible to understand the deeper nature and meaning of reality. We have got to break through this. We absolutely must begin creating institutional spaces for the exploration, re-examination, the maturing of our stories, growing from all of the sources of knowledge that we have available to us. And that's one reason I'm kind of excited about meeting with Unitarians in this General Assembly and with you people here. Because of the many faith institutions, the Unitarians, I think, are the most positioned and oriented toward exploring these deepest questions within an institutional frame. Now, all of this, of course, moves us in the direction of rethinking our economies at the most foundational level. And here's what I see emerging as what I call the sacred life and living earth story, the counter to the sacred money and market story. Essentially, it is almost the exact opposite on every point of the sacred money and market story. So we start out, time is life. Real wealth is living wealth. Money is just a number. It's useful as a medium of exchange in a well-regulated market, but that's all. We humans are living beings. We are born of and nurtured by a living earth, itself born of a living universe. Here's a key. Life exists only in community, within which life self-organizes to maintain the conditions essential to life. There is, from that absurdity that there is no community, to the deeper reality that there is no life without community. We are a part of nature, not apart from nature. Earth does not belong to us, we belong to Earth, a living superorganism that self-organizes to maintain the conditions essential to the existence of all life. Our health and well-being depend on her health and well-being. Our human nature calls us to care and share for the benefit of all. Serving the living community that sustains us is essential to community health and the source of our greatest happiness. Individualistic greed, ruthless competition, and violence against life. These are not our nature. To the contrary, these are indicators of serious psychological and societal dysfunction. They're in fact the characteristics of the psychopath. And poverty is most often the consequence of a lack of opportunity. The only legitimate purpose of any human institution, whether business, government, or civil society, is to support people as productive, contributing, sharing members of a vibrant and prosperous living earth community. Corporations are engines of wealth concentration that have an inherent tendency to undermine democracy and essential feedback mechanisms. In other words, they undermine both democracy and markets. And corporations that seek to monopolize the resources in the pursuit of purely financial ends have no place in a healthy human society. Well, this begins to give us a frame for rebuilding society, rebuilding community, rebuilding local economies that exist and function within communities and community norms. Learning to organize as nature organizes, around bioregions that are fundamentally self-reliant in terms of meeting their own needs within their own resources. And we can go further with a discussion of the organizational dynamics, the system dynamics, and so forth that are essential to this process, the intricate adaptation that is required for living communities to maximize their generative potential, their capacity to support and maintain themselves. that the decision-making everywhere is local. So you begin to see the frame for an economy that is in every element the exact opposite of the global economy that we are evolving, and an economy that operates by the rules that our unfortunate president and his corporate colleagues in Congress are advancing through these new corporate rights agreements called the TPP and the other agreements that are now beginning to come before Congress. So this is kind of the context of our work. I've gone a little longer than I intended for the
In every corner of the world, we are being pressured by a monoculture, a global consumer monoculture. It is being pushed by our governments who have a blind idea of growth and development. That means supporting and subsidizing giant multinational corporations and banks, particularly through trade treaties, by deregulating global trade and finance. We're removing rules for Monsanto, for Walmart, for Coca-Cola, so that they can move more freely, and allowing foreign investment to come into every country. Now, all of that constitutes a breakdown of community. Unemployment, financial insecurity, impoverished governments are a consequence of this. And all the while, this global corporate economy uses more and more energy, more and more resources.
The promise of development and progress is starting to crack. The issues facing us are connected to a common global economic system. All of our people are being squeezed every day by that. And all of our imaginations are being colonized by that system.
It's a story of either continuing poverty and deprivation or new forms of poverty and deprivation. So both ecologically and socially, economically, we are actually on a very steep process of decline and sustainability and conflicts which are arising out of that.
More and more, everything is being put into the hands of big corporations. In particular crops, entire markets have been taken over by corporations like Monsanto.
We are importing and exporting the same products in the global economy, creating a distance between production and consumption so that the food that people eat on a daily basis is coming from further and further away.
There is alternative. The alternative lies in reverse this process and to regain control over the territorial and the very material basis of our existence.
The resistance now to globalization will not come from the government of India or from the government of Brazil or the government of Mexico, which is in cahoots with the United States government on several issues. It will only come from local communities everywhere.
People are not taking things lying down. Either they're resisting these forms of destructive development and or they are creating their own alternative ways of human well-being.
very urgent need for a new kind of dialogue between people living in the global north and the global south.
We want to shift this global business to local business, which means give strength to the people and to real economy and not to the financial and fantasy economy.
At the bottom level, what we need to do to create change is to reconnect with the people around us, with the land around us.
It's about rebuilding our deeper connections to nature and to ourselves. And this is a structural way of doing it, localizing economic activity.
And you'll still have a relationship maybe with people in the United States and so on, but those will be cultural relationships. Maybe even some economic relationships, but they're not relationships of dependence.
The localization movement is growing. At the heart of this movement is a very broad and very powerful local food movement that is gaining momentum around the world. That is accompanied by local business alliances, local energy, decentralized renewable energy systems, local finance. You had a revival of local knowledge systems, and very importantly, local spiritual traditions that recognize and reinforce the oneness of life.
What we need is not scaling up of those solutions, but scaling out of those solutions, replication in millions of these variety of solutions, innovative solutions that are emerging. It's quite possible.
What we need to do is to actually create platforms in which these sorts of initiatives are able to get together, are able to synergize, are able to actually build those larger narratives, are able to begin to change the public discourse.
We're trying to create an alliance, an international alliance for localization, because we need a united no, one giant no to a continuation of that system. And at the same time, we need to see ourselves as actually part of an enormous movement involving hundreds of millions of people that are saying many yeses to diverse ecosystems, diverse cultures, diverse identities. This is about reclaiming our right to be who we are in our different ways of being. It's about reclaiming the diversity that is life.
We used to believe it was all human nature, and there wasn't too much you could do. War is inevitable, that's what they said, and everyone thought it was true. So we blasted away with our bombs and our guns, till the smoke finally cleared and the fighting was done, only to find out that no one had won. Way back in the days before the end of war. Once some guy went so far to say, try to imagine no heaven, no hell, and no God. No king, no country, not even possessions. We all thought he was asking a lot. So we kept on fighting for all of this stuff, but it never turned out to be reason enough to justify losing people we loved. Yeah, that's what we did before the end of war. The end of war. happen, but it wasn't by some grand decree. It's like trying to explain why nobody saw it once everyone started to see that the world was much smaller than ever before, and over there wasn't so far anymore. What we did unto others washed up on our shore. The answer was hard to ignore.